Dark truth, terrifying promise, deadly reality. A compact, steel-faced attacker dives low over a frozen plain, fires a single 75mm shell, and a Soviet tank erupts in flame. Yet moments later, a Soviet fighter roars in, and the German pilot in that armored cockpit fights the stick with both hands, struggling to claw upward through thin power and poor visibility. This is the story of the Henschel HS-129, Hitler's supposed answer to the tank threat, built for brutal ground attack, but bound by hidden limits that turned a bold idea into a desperate gamble. Let us ask the hard question together. Why did this heavily armored tank buster never become the savior of German ground forces against the waves of Soviet armor, even though it carried some of the most powerful aircraft guns of the war and could shrug off small arms fire that shredded lesser planes? You will see the reason, buried inside design orders, engine shortages, and tactical realities very soon. The roots of the HS-129 reach back to the late 1930s, when the Reich Aviation Ministry sought a Schlachtflugzeug, a ground attack aircraft hardened for low-level runs against troops, trucks, and tanks, after lessons from the Spanish Civil War showed that even aircraft ill-suited for ground attack could be effective when pressed into the role. The ministry demanded heavy armor around the pilot, protection against rifle and machine gun fire, and a cockpit with armored glass on the order of nearly 3 inches or about 75mm, a startling figure that tells you how dangerous low-level work was expected to be. But there was a catch that would haunt the program. To avoid competition with key fighter and bomber production, the new aircraft had to use engines not required elsewhere, a policy decision that sounded practical, but placed the design in a straitjacket from the start. Henschel's chief designer, Friedrich Nicholas, responded with a compact twin-engine monoplane built around a literal armored bathtub enclosing the pilot to shoulder height, forming a triangular cross-section fuselage that deflected bullets but left almost no room for movement or instrumentation. The instrument panel vanished under the nose, the gun sight perched outside on the forward skin, and some engine gauges migrated onto the inside faces of the nacelles, where the pilot could glance sideways to read them, a stark sign of how cramped the cockpit had become. On the 29th of May, 1939, the first prototype took to the air with Argus AS-410 engines rated at under 500 horsepower each, or roughly 340 kilowatts, and the trouble emerged at once. The airframe was overweight, the engines underpowered, and the controls heavy in high-speed dives, to the point that the second prototype crashed on the 5th of January 1940 when the pilot could not pull out of a dive due to extreme stick forces. Still, the aircraft was small and cheaper than its rival from Focke-Wulf, so it carried on, not because it was ideal, but because it was the more feasible compromise. The HS-129A series remained troubled, and frontline evaluation units refused it, citing poor visibility and lethargic performance that made strafing and pullout dangerous at the treetop altitudes where survival hinged on split-second control. A lifeline appeared after the fall of France when stocks of captured French Gnome, Rhone, 14M radials became available. These 14-cylinder engines produced about 700 metric horsepower for takeoff, roughly 690 standard horsepower, or 515 kilowatts, and could be installed in counter-rotating pairs to tame torque on takeoff. With these radials, the B-series took shape, and the cockpit glazing was redesigned to increase visibility, though the armored bathtub still constrained sightlines and movement in ways no canopy tweak could fully cure. Production settled on the B variants during early 1942, and the figures tell a sober story. A total production around 870 aircraft of all versions, accepted through late 1944, with about 841 in the B series and roughly 24 to a bit more than 24 B-3 anti-tank conversions mounting the 75mm gun before the line shut down in September 1944. Put those totals beside the tens of thousands of Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters, more than 33,000, and the scarcity of this specialized attacker becomes clear, with only a handful of squadrons equipped at any one time, typically on the order of 5 units by the summer of 1943. Technically, the HS-129B2 measured about 32 feet in length, or just under 10 meters, with a wingspan near 46 feet 7 inches, or roughly 14 meters, and an empty weight around 8,863 pounds, or about 4,020 kilograms, rising to more than 11,500 pounds, or roughly 5,250 kilograms, at maximum takeoff. In the clean B2 configuration, top speed reached an approximate 253 miles per hour, or about 407 kilometers per hour, at over 12,000 feet, while typical cruising sat near 196 miles per hour, or roughly 315 kilometers per hour, at close to 10,000 feet, and range was about 430 miles, or nearly 690 kilometers. In practice, with underwing stores or heavy armament, speeds fell sharply, and pilots reported long takeoff runs and modest climb on the order of about 1,400 to 1,600 feet per minute, or roughly 7 to 8 meters per second, borderline for survival when enemy fighters prowled overhead. Armament evolved fast under the pressure of Soviet armor. Early B-1 aircraft carried two 13mm MG-131 machine guns in the nose and two 20mm MG-151 cannons, with options for small bombs like 50-kilogram or 110-pound stores on wing racks and along the belly. Field kits swapped in the 30mm Mk101 and later the faster muzzle velocity Mk103 in a centerline pack, as crews searched for the right mix of penetration and recoil control to punch through sloped armor like the T-34's frontal glacis. The step to the 3.7cm BK3.7, adapted from the Army's 3.7cm flak, mirrored the parallel path taken by the Junkers Ju-87G tank hunting conversions, but on the Henschel, the space behind the cockpit allowed larger ammunition supply, improving sortie endurance against armored columns. Then came the most fearsome iteration, the B3 with the BK7.5, a 75mm board cannon derived from the Army's PAK-40, engineered with an autoloader feeding 12 rounds from a rotary magazine tucked into the wing root area behind the pilot, and a massive recoiling cannon pod slung under the fuselage. This installation, lighter than the full ground gun, but still weighing on the order of over 2,500 pounds, or about 1,200 kilograms with mechanism, could fire rapidly for an aircraft gun, with spent casings ejected out the rear of the pod, and in trials during mid-1944, the weapon could defeat even heavy Soviet armor when hits were square. On paper, it was among the most powerful forward-firing guns fitted to any production aircraft of the war, comparable in bore only to American B-25G and H versions that mounted 75mm guns, manually reloaded by a crewman, and produced in far greater overall numbers, though those American installations had different mission profiles and crew workloads. Yet power has a price. The added mass and drag pushed the already marginal HS-129 beyond its ease-of-flight envelope. Pilots reported difficulty maintaining speed after firing and severe handling penalties in the low-level environment, where mere seconds separated a successful pass from disaster. In an emergency, the gun assembly could be jettisoned to save the airframe, an extraordinary admission that the solution could swiftly become a liability if the tactical picture shifted or if engine performance sagged due to heat, dust, or battle damage. Operations began in earnest on the Eastern Front during the spring of 1942, with initial B-1 deliveries enabling a squadron to reach combat readiness in May for deployment to Crimea, where the aircraft's nose guns and early cannon kits were used to strafe and crack vehicles in direct support roles. As the German army drove into the Soviet Union, intelligence estimates of Soviet tank strength, initially numbered far lower, were shattered by the reality of tens of thousands of armored vehicles in service, a vast quantitative advantage that made any single specialized aircraft type a niche tool rather than a strategic answer. By 1943, with Operation Citadel opening in July, roughly 5 German units flew the HS-129, including flights equipped with the Mk-103, which offered improved penetration against the evolving T-34 armor and against medium tanks supporting Soviet infantry. Combat accounts mention sorties from fields like Mikoyanovka, about 12 miles or around 20 kilometers northwest of Kharkov, where pilots attacked in small formations of 4, hunting for stray armor and soft-skinned vehicles when weather and enemy air pressure allowed. Now at Kursk, the brutal defensive belts of the Red Army, layered with mines, trenches, and dense anti-aircraft positions, created a killing field for low-flying attackers. HS-129 losses in that 11-day window from the 14th to the 25th of July mounted to around 30 aircraft and pilots across air and ground losses among the anti-tank squadrons. A sharp bite from a small force that struggled to achieve its intended mission under the heavy presence of Soviet fighters and flak. After the 12th of July, the northern thrusts around Oriol stalled, and by late July the German formations were pushed back near their starting lines. A strategic reversal that meant the HS-129 crews now fought a covering action rather than leading a breakthrough. By mid-August, numbers of serviceable HS-129s reportedly fell from roughly 68 before Citadel to about 27, reflecting the cumulative effect of losses and the relentless wear on engines and systems in the dust and heat of summer operations. In North Africa, the aircraft's weaknesses were even starker. The French radial engines were vulnerable to intake dust and sand, and desert ground crews battled constant erosion and clogging that degraded reliability and thrust, lengthening takeoffs and reducing climb in environments where Allied air superiority made every second on the runway a gamble. Reports from theaters like Tunisia note that HS-129 operations required strong fighter escort to survive Allied sweeps, a luxury the shrinking Luftwaffe could not always afford by late 1942 and early 1943. The hardened nose could endure small arms hits, and pilots praised the protection as a lifeline when making repeated passes through rifle and machine gun fire. But armor did nothing against cannon-armed fighters that found the slow twin an easy catch once it had bled speed in an attack run. A-10. On the technical side, the HS-129's engineering trade-offs revealed the deeper hidden reason behind its fate. The armored bathtub and heavy forward armament built a machine that could, in theory, kill any tank of its day with a well-placed shot from a 30mm or larger weapon at close range. But those same elements inflated weight and swallowed power margins, especially at low altitude on hot days, where density altitude robbed the engines of performance. The cockpit's cramped dimensions, a consequence of the armor shape, restricted vision in the exact envelope where situational awareness meant life or death, and no amount of external sighting aids fully cured the basic problem that the pilot sat inside a narrow steel shell with limited shoulder room and minimal lateral view. Heavy stick forces in dives, documented from the earliest tests, lingered as a characteristic that made rapid pullouts with added gun weight a test of strength and timing. Weapon evolution added both potency and penalty. The Mk-103's higher muzzle velocity improved penetration versus medium armor, but the heavier BK-3.7 and the BK-7.5 transformed the aircraft into a flying gun that demanded straight and stable attack profiles, exactly the kind of runs that left it exposed to flak and interceptors. The BK-7.5's autoloading system gave 12 shots per pass at best, but re-attack windows were brief and dangerous, and airfields reported that the cannon's maintenance and supply load strained ground crews already juggling scarce spares for the French engines and field modifications. In frontline trials around May and August 1944, engineers even validated a jettison capability for the entire gun installation to preserve the aircraft if performance dropped too far in combat. a rare acknowledgement that the size of the weapon could cross a fatal threshold under real-world conditions. Production statistics underline the strategic limits. Approximately 870 aircraft produced and accepted across all years from early 1939 through late 1944, with yearly outputs of only single digits in 1941, about 221 in 1942, around 411 in 1943, and roughly 302 in 1944, ending as Germany shifted to emergency fighter programs. First-line unit counts remained modest through late 1942, at figures around 3 dozen to 40 aircraft, and even as late as January 1945, only about 59 were in frontline units, a telling number for a weapon often hyped as the tank killer of the Eastern Front. By comparison, the American B-25 series that also carried a 75mm weapon had over 1,400 G and H subtypes alone with that gun fitted, though their missions and theaters were broader, and their multi-crew configuration spread workload and reloading tasks. Personal valor punctuated the aircraft's story. Crews who mastered the HS-129's quirks could achieve startling local effects, strafing columns and disabling tanks in set-piece ambushes where friendly fighters could keep the sky clear for a short window. Accounts commonly cite pilots like Rudolf Heinz Ruffer, credited with large numbers of tank kills, figures often given as over 80, showing the heights an expert could reach when conditions aligned, though these tallies come from claims and wartime reporting rather than comprehensive modern archival reconciliations, and they must be understood within the fog of combat reporting practices on the Eastern Front. That caveat matters because the larger truth is not about a single ace or a single dramatic kill, but about the consistent constraints imposed by speed, visibility, engine reliability, and the unforgiving arithmetic of attrition and sortie rates against a numerically superior opponent. There is also a strategic irony. The HS-129 was conceived to be independent of engine bottlenecks, but reliance on offline engines. First, the Argus units that were too weak, then the French Gnome Rhone engines, whose spares and dust filtration were recurring headaches, meant that the aircraft never benefited from the incremental power increases that the mainstream German engine families received as the war progressed. Proposals to fit newer Italian Isotta Fraschini Delta inverted V engines, or even plans gesturing toward Junkers Jumo or BMW radials in notional C or D variants, remained on paper or in delayed test stages, and by the time Allied advances overran Henschel's facilities in 1945, the chance for propulsion reset had vanished. By 1944, with fuel rationed, veteran pilots dwindling, and the Eastern Front collapsing, the HS-129's limited numbers and demanding maintenance meant its effect was local, sharp in the moment, but shallow in the strategic ledger. Deliveries of the B-3 variant with the 75mm cannon amounted to only a few dozen at most, with around 25 completed as new builds before shutdown in September, and a small number by conversion. Far too few to matter against the swelling tide of Soviet armor entering the field in that late war period. When flown with the BK 7.5, crews could still crack even heavy IS series tanks when surprise, aim, and conditions aligned. But every pass cost speed and altitude, and every firing sequence flagged the aircraft for fighters and flak crews to target. Measured against the later American A-10 Warthog, the comparison that inspires the question in the first place, the differences are fundamental. The HS-129 had thin power margins, poor all-around visibility, and no standoff precision-guided munitions, operating in an air defense environment saturated with guns and often contested by enemy fighters, while the A-10 concept relies on redundant systems, powerful turbofans, superior visibility, sensors, and modern weapons that allow safer employment profiles. The Henschel's armored bathtub did what it was supposed to do, shield the pilot from small arms and fragments at low altitude, and pilots valued that protection. But the rest of the airframe, could not offset the deep penalties imposed by the weight of that armor and the mass of the weapons it carried. So here is the hidden reason promised at the start, revealed at last. The HS-129 was crushed by the very logic that birthed it. Orders to keep it out of engine competition made it underpowered. Demands for extreme armor choked pilot vision and handling. The need to kill tanks forced heavier guns that made it slower and more vulnerable after each shot. It served bravely. It struck hard in moments, and it failed to change outcomes, not because its crews lacked skill, but because its design and its numbers could not meet the scale and speed of a war that moved beyond it. On paper, the HS-129B2 could sprint at roughly 253 miles per hour, or about 407 kilometers per hour at altitude, climb near 1,500 feet per minute, or about 8 meters per second, and range about 430 miles, or nearly 690 kilometers on internal fuel. But in the mud and smoke of the front, with cannons slung beneath the belly and bombs under the wings, practical speeds sagged below 200 miles per hour, or about 320 kilometers per hour, during attack runs, leaving too little margin against interceptors and flak. By January of 1945, barely some 6 sat in frontline units, a coda to a program that delivered hundreds rather than thousands, a weapon too late, and too constrained for the tasks laid upon it. Its legacy is a cautionary lesson. An aircraft can be nearly indestructible to small arms and still be tactically fragile. It can carry the heaviest gun of its era and still struggle to survive the seconds after firing. It can be a fearsome idea, yet become a symbol of how war punishes designs trapped by compromises they cannot escape.